Hey guys, tonight we're starting with something small, something flickering, something that, believe it or not, shaped entire economies for centuries. Candles. Yes, before the magic of flipping a switch existed, before the glow of neon signs and LED screens kept us awake at 2 in the morning, people lit their nights with what was basically a stick of fat on fire. And they paid a fortune for the privilege. Now, I know what you're thinking, candles are cheap today. You can buy a pack of tea lights at the store for less than the cost of a latte. But in the Middle Ages, candles were closer to luxury goods. If you weren't rich, your evenings were probably spent in the dark, stumbling around and pretending that your eyes would eventually adjust. Spoiler, they didn't. So why exactly were candles so expensive? Well, the answer comes down to the delightful and somewhat gross world of candle-making materials. There were two main options: beeswax and tallow. Beeswax was shiny, clean, and smelled nice when burned. The problem? Bees are not industrial-level producers, and medieval beekeeping wasn't exactly optimized. Each hive gave only a limited amount of wax, and the demand, especially from churches and the wealthy, was massive. Tallow, on the other hand, was the cheaper option. It was made from rendered animal fat. Think cow or sheep, sometimes pig. Basically, the stuff left over after butchering. It was cheap, sure, but it smelled terrible. Imagine your entire house scented like a faint mixture of wet dog and barbecue grease. Lovely bedtime vibes. And it smoked. A lot. Which meant that peasants using tallow candles weren't just lighting their rooms. They were also turning their ceilings a lovely shade of soot black. Romantic. The church, of course, preferred beeswax. Because why not insist on the pricier, cleaner option when you're holding endless ceremonies? Entire monasteries and cathedrals glowed with golden candlelight, each flame essentially burning money. Ordinary people, meanwhile, usually couldn't afford them. So most of the time, they relied on daylight, a central hearth fire, or just went to bed early. Sleep schedules weren't exactly optional. But let's drift a little deeper into why beeswax candles were so expensive beyond just limited supply. See, medieval society loved its rules and monopolies. Certain guilds controlled candle production in major cities, carefully regulating who could make what, and at what price. Want to whip up some wax candles at home and sell them on the side? Good luck. That was technically illegal in places like London or Paris. And guilds didn't exactly hand out exceptions. Oh, and taxes. Always taxes. Authorities knew candles were in high demand, especially for religious use, so they taxed them accordingly. It was like medieval governments saw a flicker of light and thought, yes, that should belong to us. The result was that the glow of a beeswax candle became a kind of status symbol. If you visited a wealthy noble's hall and saw their rooms lit with bright, clean, honey-scented candles, you instantly knew. These people had money to burn. Literally. For peasants, a single beeswax candle might be saved for special occasions, like Christmas or maybe a wedding. The rest of the time, darkness was the default. And the funny thing? People didn't necessarily mind. Darkness was normal. Humans had centuries of living with it. Night wasn't for scrolling or working late, it was for sleeping or, if you couldn't sleep, quietly existing until dawn. The expensive candle market was less about everyone needs light, and more about important people need to look important. Let's float over now to another interesting aspect: the church and its near obsession with candlelight. So we left off with the church and its candle obsession. And really, it was an obsession. If you walked into a medieval cathedral, you'd find rows and rows of flickering lights, each one dutifully donated, blessed, or paid for by someone hoping their soul looked just a little shinier in heaven. Candles weren't just about lighting the altar. They were symbolic. Pure beeswax was seen as pure light, pure prayer, pure everything. Which, of course, meant it had to cost pure gold. Churches consumed wax on a staggering scale. Imagine trying to keep hundreds of candles burning every single day, from dawn until midnight vigils. That adds up fast. Monasteries sometimes managed their own beekeeping, but even then, supply was limited. And so prices soared. If you were a peasant hoping to save money by skipping the tithe, too bad, part of your contribution might still go to keeping the priest's altar glowing. Guild monopolies added another delightful layer of price inflation. In cities like Paris, only specific candlemakers could sell wax candles, and they guarded their privileges like dragons on a hoard. They set prices, enforced rules, and made sure nobody else undercut them. Tallow chandlers had their own guilds too, but they were considered the lesser cousins. Beeswax candlemaking was the elegant, respectable side of the trade. If you worked in tallow, you were basically the medieval version of a fast food fry cook. Necessary, but not glamorous. Now, here's the irony. Despite all this formality, candles were incredibly fragile commodities. They melted, they broke, they went bad. Yes, bad. Tallow candles, if stored too long, turned rancid and even more foul-smelling. Beeswax held up better, but still wasn't eternal. So, imagine paying half your week's wages for something that might slump into a sad puddle if the weather was too warm. Because, of course, refrigeration wasn't a thing. But candles weren't just about lighting a room, they were also about marking time. Without clocks in most households, people used the burn of a candle to measure hours. Some were even marked with notches for this exact purpose. It wasn't super accurate, but it worked well enough for a monk counting prayers or a merchant closing shop. Naturally, the more reliable beeswax candles made better timekeepers than smoky tallow sticks. Another reason why they were so highly prized. And while we're drifting slowly through this glowing topic, let's not forget royal courts. Kings and queens loved to show off their wealth with literal candlelight. Banquets were staged in shimmering halls lit with hundreds of wax candles. It was both atmospheric and expensive. A noble dining by torchlight looked rustic, maybe even barbaric. A noble dining by beeswax glow looked civilized, elegant, and chosen by God. It was basically the medieval version of mood lighting, except your mood was supposed to be impressed. Of course, this extravagance wasn't lost on ordinary people. Imagine walking past a cathedral blazing with candles, while your own cottage had none. It must have felt like staring at another world, one where money could turn night into day. And yet, nobody questioned the system much. Light belonged to the powerful. Darkness belonged to everyone else. Still, candles became a strange marker of generosity, too. Wealthy patrons donated wax to churches as offerings, hoping to secure blessings, forgiveness, or just good PR. So when you saw those glowing altars, you weren't just seeing worship, you were seeing donations literally go up in smoke. And that, in a soft, flickering nutshell, is why candles stayed so pricey for so long. Limited resources, church demand, guild monopolies, symbolic value, and the fact that night itself was a marketable commodity. Let's drift now toward an even more curious side effect of candle economics. How they shaped people's daily lives, sleep patterns, and even social gatherings. So, let's wander now into the way candles, or the lack of them, actually shaped daily life. And here's where things get interesting. Because when most of your world shuts down after sunset, your body and habits adapt in strange ways. Historians talk about something called the two sleeps. Basically, before the age of abundant artificial light, people often slept in two chunks. First sleep would start not long after dark, maybe around 8 or 9 p.m. Then, after a few hours, many people naturally woke up. They'd spend an hour or two awake, quietly talking, praying, or maybe just staring into the gloom. Then they'd drift back into a second sleep until dawn. Candles played into this pattern, because if you could afford a little light during that middle of the night waking period, you might read, sew, or gossip. If you couldn't, well, you just lay there and hoped the rats weren't too loud. For peasants, most evenings were dictated by firelight, not candlelight. The hearth provided warmth and glow, but it wasn't portable. If you needed to walk across the room, you lit a rushlight, basically a reed dipped in fat. Cheap, dim, smoky, and gone in minutes. Not exactly cozy. That's why a real beeswax candle, even just one, could transform a home. It gave steadier light. It made an ordinary evening feel special. And it burned without filling the air with the smell of, let's say, boiled sheep. Meanwhile, wealthier households turned candlelight into something social. Gatherings after dark, banquets, dances, readings were only possible if you had the budget for beeswax. A single evening could require dozens of candles, each one dripping money as it dripped wax. That's partly why night entertainment was a mark of status. If you got invited to a late-night feast, you weren't just getting free food. You were being welcomed into someone else's display of wealth. But even for the rich, candles weren't limitless. People counted them. They rationed them. Kings might throw dazzling banquets, but in private chambers, candles were often extinguished early to save on cost. A royal might read in bed by a single flame, just like a merchant's daughter down the street. It's a quiet reminder that light was precious, even in palaces. And here's another quirky effect. Candle theft was surprisingly common. Servants, workers, and even guests were known to pocket candles from noble houses. Why not? It was like stealing a little stick of gold. There are records of rules forbidding servants from sneaking candles out of royal banquets, which tells us it happened often enough to need rules. Now, here's something cozy. In villages, communal gatherings sometimes pooled candle resources. A wedding, for example, might feature every household contributing a little wax. The result was a rare, brightly lit celebration. People probably remembered not just the food or music, but the novelty of seeing each other clearly at night. So when we say candles were expensive, it wasn't just about money. It was about access. Access to time, to nightlife, to shared memory. To stay awake after dark without firelight was a privilege, one that marked where you stood in the medieval hierarchy. Let's gently drift now to the long shadow of this glowing economy, how the high cost of candles lingered well into the early modern era, and how eventually new sources of light finally broke the monopoly of wax and fat. By the time we drift into the early modern period, you'd think someone would have figured out a way to make candles cheaper. Spoiler, not really. They stayed pricey well into the 18th century, and people kept grumbling about the same things. Beeswax was too expensive, tallow was too smelly, and daylight was still free. But alternatives did start creeping in. One of the big ones was whale oil. Yes, for reasons only humans could come up with, the solution to expensive candles was to start hunting giant sea mammals. Whale oil wasn't usually made into candles at first. It was used in oil lamps. These burned brighter and longer than most tallow options, but they came with their own problems. The smell was, let's say, unique. Imagine fish that's been sitting in the sun all week, politely wafting through your living room. Romantic? Not exactly. Still, whale oil was cheaper and more scalable than trying to convince bees to work overtime, which meant cities started turning to oil lamps for street lighting. Paris, London, Amsterdam all gradually experimented with illuminating their streets at night, at least in certain neighborhoods. Suddenly, the night wasn't quite as dark as it used to be. But for private homes, especially wealthier ones, beeswax candles remained the gold standard of indoor light. They were still cleaner, prettier, and less oily than a lamp. And let's not forget spermaceti. This was the waxy substance taken from the head cavity of sperm whales. It turned out to be perfect for candles, harder, brighter, and less smelly than tallow. By the 18th century, spermaceti candles became the premium product of the lighting world, which sounds nice until you remember that the raw material involved killing enormous whales and scooping out their heads. So, really, the glowing dinner parties of the Enlightenment were lit by what we could politely call whale brain goo. But the old symbolism of beeswax never really went away. The church kept using it. Wealthy households still displayed it. And even as lamps and oils spread, the candle remained a kind of cultural touchstone. There was something about a flame in wax that felt traditional, sacred, even nostalgic, which is probably why we still use candles for ceremonies today, long after we've stopped depending on them for actual light. Meanwhile, ordinary people kept making do. Tallow remained the peasant staple, though improved techniques eventually made it a little less smoky and rancid. In fact, some households got crafty and mixed different fats together, balancing cost with smell. The result wasn't glamorous, but it worked. And when you're trying not to trip over the dog at midnight, you don't exactly care if the candle is fancy. The real shift only came with gas lighting and, later, electricity. Suddenly, light wasn't a fragile, expensive commodity anymore. It could be piped into streets and houses in endless supply. Candles started sliding down from necessity to decoration. They lost their monopoly on night, And yet, the irony is this. Once candles became obsolete, they got cheaper. Industrial methods made wax production easier. Paraffin wax, derived from petroleum, created cheap, clean-burning candles by the 19th century. The very thing that had once marked wealth and holiness turned into something you could buy by the dozen in any shop. But in medieval times, none of that existed. To own a beeswax candle was to hold a piece of light that others could only dream of. To burn one was to show wealth, faith, or generosity. And to live without them was normal. Darkness wasn't scary. It was simply the other half of life. So, in the end, the secret reason candles were so expensive wasn't just bees or guilds or taxes. It was that night itself had a price tag. And for centuries, only the wealthy could afford to buy it.